Tonight we walk back, far back, beneath a sky without electric glare, where the only lights are stars and the oily glow of a pilgrim's torch. You're standing on a dirt road that smells of horses, sweat, and cheap wine, somewhere between nowhere and the edge of the known world. The year? Let's just say no one's invented deodorant yet. You're wrapped in a cloak that itches, your boots leak, and you're starting to question this entire life choice. You probably won't survive this, honestly. But the promise of redemption, and maybe a shiny seashell, keeps you going. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along the ancient pilgrim road, the Via Francigena or perhaps the Camino Francis, it hardly matters. Every route eventually spills toward the west, to Santiago de Compostela. Your breath fogs the cool dawn, your walking stick thuds against rutted soil, and every so often you glance up to see another soul ahead, a silhouette bent beneath a bundle. The journey feels infinite. You start to notice how the earth itself seems to guide you. Sun at your back, rumors ahead. They say at the end of this road, beyond hills, forests, and thieves, lies not only the bones of St. James but a wild coast where the sea itself grants absolution. You laugh quietly to yourself, who makes a 1,000-mile hike for a seashell? Then again, who hasn't done something ridiculous for a promise they barely understand? In the Middle Ages, belief is its own kind of fuel, thicker than soup, sharper than hunger. The road smells of wet wool and incense. Fellow pilgrims mutter Latin blessings like half-remembered pop songs. You catch fragments of stories, of miracles, healings, and a mysterious shell found gleaming on the sand like a coin dropped by an angel. No one seems to question it much. After weeks on the road, you'd believe in a talking goat if it offered to carry your pack. You pass a milestone carved with a scallop symbol, crude and familiar. The shell is everywhere, scratched into doors, painted on inns, worn around necks. You're told that each groove on a scallop's fan shape represents a pilgrim's road, all leading to one sacred point, the tomb of St. James. A neat metaphor, even if it feels a little too convenient. Historians still argue whether the shell became a symbol because of the pilgrimage, or whether the pilgrimage grew around a symbol that already existed. Either way, the marketing is brilliant. Night falls fast. You join others at a way station, chewing bread so hard it could double as a weapon. The room hums with snores, coughs, and the occasional prayer. You try to rest, but your feet throb, and your mind drifts to the sea. They say when you finally reach the coast, you'll collect a shell as proof that you've made it, a physical sign of divine favor. In an age before selfies, a seashell is the medieval version of a check-in post. Outside, a wind howls through the shutter gaps, rattling the walls like a warning. You imagine the Atlantic, wild and indifferent, its waves rolling in from a world you can't imagine, perhaps the edge of existence itself. Some whisper that beyond those waves lies paradise, or at least a place where sinners are scrubbed clean. You picture yourself standing barefoot in the surf, scooping up a shell glinting like a small moon, and you almost feel forgiven. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Tomorrow, you'll cross a field where the grass hides ancient bones. Bandits might follow. The weather will turn. And still, you'll walk, because everyone on this road shares a kind of madness, faith wrapped in blisters. Pilgrims once carried no maps, only symbols, crosses, staffs, and eventually shells, to prove their intent. In a way, those shells were early passports. Show one to a guard or a monk, and doors might open. Show it to a thief, and maybe they'd pity you enough to leave you with your shoes. There's a curious side note here. Archaeologists have found scallop shells from Santiago as far north as Norway and as far east as Hungary, which means people really did make it home. Or at least their belongings did. The shells show up in graves too, stitched onto cloaks, pinned to hats, clasped in dead hands. Even after death, pilgrims clung to that promise of arrival. As you drift toward sleep, a companion mumbles a story of a knight who doubted the pilgrimage. Legend says that when St. James appeared to him, the saint's horse plunged into the ocean and rose again covered in shells, proof of the apostle's power. You try to imagine it, waves foaming around a spectral horse, shells clinging like stars to its flanks. It's a tale built for belief, and for selling more scallops at the next port. Your eyes close. You dream of the tide dragging over sand, of shells whispering secrets in a language older than prayer. In that dream, you already hold one in your palm. It's smooth and curved, a perfect fit. You raise it to your ear, not to hear the sea, but to listen for something else, something like your own heartbeat slowed to the rhythm of eternity. When dawn returns, the world smells of damp hay and faint hope. You lace your boots again, wincing. The road continues, as all roads do. Somewhere out there, at the world's wet edge, the shells wait for you. You wonder, not for the last time, why something so small could carry so much meaning. Perhaps it's because, deep down, you know you'll never really reach the end of the journey. You'll just keep walking, one dusty step at a time, toward a horizon that smells faintly of salt and grace. You wake stiff and chilled, the sunrise seeping into your bones like tepid soup. The camp stares, pilgrims groaning, chickens scratching, someone already arguing over who borrowed whose spoon. You shoulder your pack again, feeling that familiar tug of exhaustion and purpose. The road stretches west, dusted in gold, and every footstep pulls you closer to the reason everyone here whispers about: Santiago de Compostela, the city of St. James, the place where seashells shine like halos. By now, you've heard the story a dozen times in a dozen accents. It always begins with the Apostle James, who, after spreading the gospel across Iberia, was martyred back in Jerusalem. His followers, the legend claims, loaded his body into a boat without sails, crew, or map, and somehow the tide carried it all the way to Galicia. There, they buried him in secret, and centuries later, a shepherd saw a field glowing with starlight, the Campus Stelli, the field of stars. And that's how Compostela got its name. Conveniently poetic, don't you think? As you walk, you can almost see it. The starry field, the hidden tomb, the sudden rush of faith that sent thousands of people, farmers, knights, widows, thieves, onto the roads, all believing that by reaching that place, their souls would earn a little celestial credit. Medieval Europe loved a good relic, and St. James's bones were first class. You might not survive the journey, but if you did, you'd come home with your sins wiped cleaner than your laundry. And somewhere in that mix of penance and tourism, the seashell became the proof. The scallop shell, Pecten Jacobaeus, the shell of James, turned up along the Galician coast. Pilgrims began wearing them home as a badge of arrival, a spiritual receipt. Over time, they became standardized, like medieval merch. Even before mass production, the human urge to brand an experience was alive and well. You overhear a pair of fellow travelers debating whether it's acceptable to buy a shell before reaching the sea. One insists it's cheating, the other shrugs and says salvation is expensive anyway. You smile. Even now, centuries later, historians still argue whether the shells were genuinely found or mostly sold. Archaeological digs suggest that pilgrims bought ready-cleaned shells from merchants in Santiago itself. Souvenirs stands avant la lettre. But the faithful version of the story? That you reach the sea, kneel, and pluck your own from the surf. Like grace, you must earn it. Midday heat swells. The road bakes beneath your feet. The smell of sweat and horse dung hangs heavy. You pass through a village where every doorway bears a painted scallop. The local innkeeper calls out in a practiced tone, "Good luck to Compostela." He sells you weak ale and, for a few extra coins, a stamped letter proving your pilgrimage so far. Bureaucracy and belief. Always bedfellows. A child hands you a small wooden carving of a shell, worn smooth from many palms. For St. James, she says, so he'll see you on the road. You take it, touched despite yourself. There's something disarming about how easily people share their faith out here. Maybe it's exhaustion. Maybe it's survival instinct. Maybe it's just easier to believe when your entire life is carried on your back. By dusk, you catch sight of a hilltop lined with crosses, each one tangled with ribbons, rosaries, and bits of fabric. Pilgrims leave pieces of themselves here, literally. One woman ties a braid of her hair to a post, whispering a name. Another buries a small wooden toy. You add a pebble from your pocket, a promise to return alive. The shells, the ribbons, the stones, they are all versions of the same human impulse. Proof that you were here, that your pain meant something. As the stars return, you make camp by a stream. The water is so clear it looks holy by default. Someone begins to sing a hymn in Latin, badly, but the rhythm lulls you. The fire crackles, and you catch fragments of conversation about the road ahead. Wolves, storms, miracles. One man insists that pilgrims who die on the way go straight to heaven. Convenient motivation, if you ask me. Then a bearded friar tells a different tale, that the scallop shell wasn't originally about St. James at all. In pre-Christian times, he says, shells were sacred to Venus, the goddess of love, and symbolized rebirth. The early church, rather than erase the symbol, simply borrowed it, rebranded it. You raise an eyebrow, wondering if that's true. Historians still argue whether the shell's sacred meaning predates Christianity, absorbed like so many pagan echoes. But in that moment, around the fire, it feels plausible. Maybe faith is always a mosaic, bits of old gods and new hopes glued together by need. The friar chuckles. When pilgrims collect a shell, he says, they are not just taking home proof, they are taking home the sea itself. A reminder that faith, like water, shifts and changes, never still. You think about that for a while, about how every ripple carries something ancient forward. The next morning, the road tilts west again, and you fall into the long rhythm of walking. Your thoughts dissolve into the sound of your boots. Ahead, the land begins to smell faintly of salt, though you know the coast is still far away. Every mile hums with purpose. The shell has become not just a souvenir, but a kind of beacon. Somewhere in your imagination, the sea waits like a vast blue altar. You picture the waves catching sunlight, each one curled like the edge of a scallop. You wonder if you'll recognize the moment when belief becomes real, when the legend stops being someone else's story and becomes yours. You adjust your pack, squint against the glare, and keep walking. A small part of you already feels lighter, as if that seashell is calling your name, promising a kind of peace you haven't earned yet but still desperately hope for. By the time you reach the next town, the sky has gone bruised with twilight. You find lodging in a crowded hall, walls plastered with old scallop badges, thin lead replicas hammered into the shape of the real thing. Cheap imitations for weary travelers who can't make it to the sea. You touch one gently, thinking of all the hands that must have done the same. It's not the real shell, but it carries the same longing. That night, you dream again of the tide, rolling slow and silver, scattering shells like blessings. You wake with sand under your fingernails, probably just dirt, but you smile anyway. Something tells you you're getting close. Morning rises soft and hazy, like parchment soaked in sunlight. Your legs ache, but the rhythm of walking has become a sort of meditation, each step a quiet confession. The pilgrims around you move as one breathing organism, creaking, coughing, humming. You begin to notice how every walking stick, every hat, every tattered cloak seems to bear the same curved pattern, the scallop shell. It's no longer just decoration, it's language. You're speaking in shells now, fluent in the grammar of devotion. You pause beside a roadside shrine, where a wooden carving of St. James, Santiago Peregrino, stares out with carved patience. His cloak is dotted with little white shells, each groove catching the dust. That's the mark of the true pilgrim saint. You reach up, brushing a fingertip across one shell, and for a moment it feels warm, as if holding sunlight from a different century. The symbolism clicks in your mind, the many lines of the scallop's surface converging to one point, like the dozens of pilgrimage routes across Europe all leading to the same holy tomb. It's poetic geometry, really. Even modern historians can't resist it. They note that maps of the Camino resemble the ridges of a shell spreading across the continent. Whether that design was intentional or a happy coincidence is up for debate. Historians still argue whether medieval travelers consciously built the scallop into their imagination of geography or simply borrowed its shape later to make sense of chaos. Either way, it's satisfying. You love a metaphor that fits in your pocket. You imagine medieval artisans carving the image into church lintels and prayer books, turning a humble seashell into a celestial brand logo. In an age without social media, this is how you'd announce to the world that you'd made it. You wore your scallop proudly. Some pilgrims tied it to their hats, others stitched it to cloaks or hung it from belts like a rattle of holiness. Archaeologists have found dozens of these shells in old graves and wells, pierced carefully at the top to make space for a cord. A fashion statement with eternal guarantees. You pass a small chapel where pilgrims line up to receive blessings. The priest blesses you too, tapping your shoulder with a wand of rosemary and murmuring Latin that sounds suspiciously like a spell. He presses into your palm a small lead badge, molded into the shape of a scallop. For protection, he says, smiling with the kind of tired gentleness that priests acquire after decades of listening to confessions that all sound the same. The badge is heavy and cool. You slip it into your pouch. A few others sell identical ones outside, unblessed, but cheaper. You overhear a French pilgrim joke that he'll buy 10 and start his own holy franchise back home. It gets a laugh, but the idea isn't far off. Those shells and badges spread across Europe like holy currency. A medieval pilgrim could travel hundreds of miles and be recognized instantly by the scallop on their chest. It meant food, shelter, and, if luck was good, a little respect. The sun climbs higher. The road forks through vineyards and dusty plains. Every now and then, you find a shell nailed to a post or drawn on a stone. Signposts for those who can't read words but can read symbols. You follow them like breadcrumbs. The air smells faintly of resin and earth. You walk beside a woman from Flanders who carries her shell all ready, polished and faintly pink. She says she bought it in a port town before starting out, so St. James knows I'm coming. You raise an eyebrow, but she shrugs. It's not cheating if it helps me believe. That line stays with you for miles. Later that afternoon, you rest by a stream where water glitters like shards of glass. You wash your hands, noticing how the ripples mimic the curves of a shell, small waves radiating outward. Nature seems to conspire in metaphors. You can't help but smile. Somewhere between faith and fatigue, symbolism becomes reality. A fellow traveler, an old man with a walking staff taller than he is, tells you about the scallop's miracle of design. He insists that its ridges aren't just beautiful, they serve purpose. Each groove channels water, he says, so the pilgrim can drink from it without spilling. You test the idea later, filling a broken shell at the stream. It kind of works, though you mostly end up soaked. Still, it's a charming thought, that God gave the shell this shape just to make pilgrim life marginally less miserable. You find yourself laughing more easily now, even at the absurdity of it all. Faith and practicality, hand in hand like two slightly tipsy dancers. By evening, You reach a ridge overlooking a vast expanse of green hills. From here, the world feels enormous and intimate at once. The woman from Flanders hums a tune about St. James guiding the lost. You join in, half singing, half mumbling. Your voice cracks, but no one minds. The song rolls down the hillside like a prayer-shaped echo. You make camp, sharing bread and dried figures. Someone produces a jug of wine, miraculously not yet vinegar, and the laughter that follows warms the night air. Talk drifts back to the shell again, where it comes from, what it means. A young squire claims that knights once wore scallop shells on their armor to mark themselves as defenders of the faith. Another swears that the ridges of the shell symbolize the virtues one must gather along the road: patience, humility, endurance, and an immunity to bad cooking. You're not sure that last one counts, but it earns a chuckle. And then, quieter now, someone asks the question everyone's thinking: does it really matter? The shell, I mean. You look into the fire, watching embers drift upward like tiny stars. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just calcium carbonate. But maybe it's the story you build around it that matters. The journey, the struggle, the choice to keep walking even when your feet feel like boiled cabbage. The wind rises, carrying a faint tang of salt. You close your eyes and imagine the sea again, the way it will sound, the way it will cool your blistered feet. For now, the shell is still out there, waiting. And you, stubbornly, beautifully human, keep walking toward it. You wake to rain that feels personal, each drop sharp enough to make you suspect divine criticism. The sky sulks, the road turns to pudding, and the cheerful pilgrims who sang hymns last night now curse under their breath in at least 5 languages. You wrap your cloak tighter, muttering something saintly-sounding just to balance the cosmic books. Ahead, the next village emerges through mist like a smudge of grey roofs. The sign nailed to a post reads, with charming optimism, Santiago, only 230 miles. Easy. Only another lifetime. The town is louder than you expect. Market stalls clutter the square, each one shouting its wares with medieval enthusiasm: spices, candles, cheap relics, sausages that look older than the church beside them. You follow your nose and your curiosity to a booth decked with shimmering shells. They dangle from cords and hat pins, painted in bright pigments, reds, blues, even gilded edges. The merchant, a man with a smile polished by long practice, waves you closer. From the coast, he insists, lifting one shell like a chalice. Blessed by the waters of Finisterre itself. Guaranteed to bring safe passage and divine forgiveness. You ask quietly if he's been to the coast himself. He coughs theatrically and changes the subject to bog pricing. Here it is, then, the medieval gift shop. Every pilgrimage eventually meets its capitalism. Seashells, once tokens of grace gathered from the tide, are now a full-blown economy. You can buy the sacred, if you've got coins to spare. Some stalls even sell fake relics, splinters from the true cross, feathers from an angel's wing, and one spectacular fraud offering a tooth of Jonah's whale. The market hums with equal parts piety and hustle. You laugh quietly to yourself. Faith, it turns out, has always needed a good marketing department. Historians still argue whether most pilgrims actually found their shells on the beach or simply bought them here from entrepreneurial locals who realize there's good money in salvation. Archaeological finds suggest entire workshops near Santiago specialized in carving or etching shells, mass-producing holiness before the term even existed. As you wander deeper into the market, you spot a curious sight: a man hammering lead badges shaped like scallops, his anvil singing a sharp rhythm. Each badge bears a tiny emblem, crossed pilgrim staffs or the words Deus Vult. He sells them by the dozen to travelers too poor for the real shell. You realize how easily faith scales. Rich or poor, everyone wants to take a piece of belief home. A nearby stall sells charms said to enhance the shell's power. Tiny bells to ward off spirits, bits of colored glass to reflect evil eyes, even a jar labeled Holy Sea Air that smells suspiciously like vinegar. You're not sure what's more amusing, the con or the customers who buy it with trembling hands. Still, you feel a sting of sympathy. Out here, miracles are in short supply, and people cling to symbols like driftwood. You duck into a tavern to escape the rain. The air inside is thick with smoke, laughter, and the kind of body odor that could end a war. Pilgrims sit shoulder to shoulder, showing off their new shells like prized trophies. One man swears his glows faintly at night. Another claims that his whispered the name of St. James during a thunderstorm. A third says his shell cured his gout, though he's limping as he says it. You sip watered wine and listen, half amused, half enchanted. The tavern keeper, an older woman with eyes like sharp flint, leans over your table. You know, she says, those shells come from a mile inland. She grins when you blink in surprise. We haul them up from the coast, trade them to merchants, and by the time they reach here, they've multiplied like fish in the loaves. You laugh. It's a good scam, Holy Pyramid scheme meets roadside souvenir stand. But she lowers her voice. Don't mock them too loudly. Some of those shells do work miracles. A man once drank from one and survived the plague. She pauses, eyes glinting. Of course, maybe he just had good lungs. You toast her honesty with your cup, earning a small nod of approval. Outside, the rain eases. You step back into the square where the market still buzzes. It's hard to tell where faith ends and theater begins. Even the monks who wander through seem half performers, offering blessings in exchange for donations. One friar dips shells in holy water and sprinkles passers-by, promising that one drop equals 1,000 pardons. You get misted accidentally when a gust of wind shifts. Hopefully that covers you for at least this week's sins. By dusk, the marketplace quiets. You walk beyond the last stalls, the road softening again under your boots. The scallop shell you bought, or maybe just adopted, hangs from your pouch. It feels both sacred and suspicious, like wearing a lie that still comforts you. But isn't that what half of faith is? You smile wryly, thinking of the friar's words. Belief needs props, or else it slips through your fingers. You pass a small chapel at the edge of town. The door is open, and candlelight spills across the threshold. Inside, a handful of pilgrims kneel in silence, their shells glinting faintly in the flicker. You join them, laying your own on the step. For a long minute, you stare at it. The shell seems ordinary, just calcium, curves, and memory. Yet in that stillness, you feel something stir beneath its surface, something older than commerce or creed. Maybe faith isn't about the object itself but the way you decide to see it. You whisper a clumsy prayer, half gratitude, half apology, and rise. Outside, the rain has stopped entirely. The road gleams in moonlight, a long silver ribbon leading west. You tuck the shell safely away. It's yours now, for better or worse, a mix of relic and receipt. As you walk out of town, a stray thought drifts through your tired brain. Centuries from now, people will still chase souvenirs. Different shapes, different reasons, same longing. They'll still stand in gift shops, wondering whether to spend their last coin on a piece of meaning they can hold. You grin into the night. Maybe human nature hasn't evolved as much as it likes to think. The shell bumps gently against your hip as you walk, a tiny, rhythmic reminder that belief, bought or found, still finds a way to follow you home. The next morning greets you with the smell of brine. It's faint at first, like a rumor whispered by the wind. But it's there, the sea, calling from somewhere just beyond the hills. You quicken your pace, heart thudding with the strange excitement of nearing an ending you've imagined for weeks. Every puddle gleams brighter, Every gust of air feels sharper, saltier. Your shell clinks softly against your pack, as if it already knows it's coming home. By midday, the land begins to change. The trees lean westward, sculpted by years of Atlantic breath. The soil grows sandy, the air heavy and alive. Pilgrims around you murmur prayers, the kind that sound rehearsed but still tremble with awe. Someone shouts, "The sea!" and everyone rushes forward as if salvation has just gone on sale. And there it is. The Atlantic, enormous, indifferent, shimmering under a bruised sky. You stop in your tracks. It looks nothing like the holy image you've carried in your head. It's wild, chaotic, endless, loud enough to drown thought. Waves crash like collapsing walls, and gulls scream overhead, impatient and unholy. You stand at the edge of the known world, where medieval maps once drew dragons and warnings, "Here be monsters." You grin. Turns out the monsters are just waves. This is where pilgrims have come for centuries, to the edge, to wash away their sins, to claim the sacred shell that proves they've completed the journey. Some call this beach the end of the earth, Finisterre. Others prefer its Latin name, Fines Terrae, the ends of the lands. And yet, standing here, it feels more like the beginning of something than the end. You wade forward, boots sinking in wet sand. The cold shocks you awake, biting through fabric and flesh. You bend down, hand trembling, and lift a scallop shell from the surf. It's smaller than you expected, paler, chipped at the edge, but somehow perfect. This is the moment everyone promised. You've seen drawings of it in churches, the pilgrim kneeling, the shell shining like a miniature halo. In reality, it's just you, a sore-legged traveler holding up a wet mollusk. But still, you feel it. The quiet click of meaning snapping into place. You laugh out loud. One of the nearby pilgrims gives you a look, but you don't care. You're laughing because you realize how utterly human this is, to cross continents just to pick something up and declare it holy. And maybe that's what makes it beautiful. You rinse your hands in the tide, letting the waves tug against your fingers. Tradition says this act cleanses you, spiritually and physically, a fresh start delivered by salt water. Pilgrims used to bathe here entirely, shedding their old clothes and burning them on the sand to symbolize rebirth. You decide against full nudity. The breeze alone could freeze your soul solid. Still, you scoop water onto your face, tasting the salt, and for a heartbeat, you feel almost new. There's a crowd gathered farther down the beach. Some are kneeling, some praying, some simply staring. One man holds up his shell and whispers something into it like a confession. Another throws his into the waves, an offering, he says, to ensure safe return home. You clutch yours tighter. You've walked too far to toss it away. A friar wades ankle-deep into the surf, chanting blessings over the gathered pilgrims. His robe soaks and clings, the hem dark with sand. He's holding a staff capped with, you guessed it, a carved scallop shell. He speaks of purification, of the journey's end, of the saint's watchful eye. The sound of his voice almost disappears beneath the roar of waves, yet somehow you understand. You close your eyes, and for a moment, it's not about relics or rituals or sales pitches. It's about standing where land ends and sky begins, realizing you are very small and yet somehow infinite. Then, inevitably, reality intrudes. A merchant nearby is already selling cords to tie your shell properly, for just a fair donation. His helper is hawking small bottles of seawater as official relics of the Western Ocean. You smile, of course. The holy and the hustle walk the same path. Always have. As the sun dips lower, the sea glows orange, then gold. You sit on a rock, letting the wind dry your face. Around you, pilgrims begin their return rituals. Some pray, others sing, and one particularly dramatic man recites poetry to his shell as if auditioning for sainthood. You just breathe. The salt sticks to your lips. Your hands smell faintly of iron and life. You look at the shell again, its ridges catching the dying light, and you think of every step that brought you here. A local fisherman passes by, amused by the gathering. He tells you in a mix of Galician and gestures that long before pilgrims came, villagers already collected these shells for practical reasons. For drinking scoops, for decoration, even as spoons. The scallop has always been useful. Maybe the pilgrims just added a layer of poetry to something ordinary. Historians still argue whether the shell's sacred symbolism came before or after its practical use, but you suspect both are true. Humans rarely separate function from faith. We want our miracles to fit in our hands. The tide creeps closer, hissing around your boots. You stand, holding the shell one last time before slipping it into your pouch. It feels heavier now, not from weight but from meaning. You've reached the sea, you've done what millions did before you, and somehow, that connects you to all of them. Across centuries, across languages, across doubt itself. A gull lands nearby, cocking its head at you with the indifference of a creature who's seen too many pilgrims cry over seashells. You salute it anyway. Then you turn inland, ready to begin the long walk home. As you leave the beach, you glance back once more. The sea keeps rolling, endless, unbothered. The shells will keep washing up, waiting for the next wave of hopeful fools to claim them. And maybe that's the point. The sea doesn't care if you believe in it. It just is. And for tonight, that's enough. You've done it. You've touched the sea, claimed your shell, and felt that faint tremor of redemption ripple through your bones. Now comes the quieter part, keeping it safe. You wrap it carefully in a scrap of cloth and tuck it into the pouch at your side. It's ridiculous, really, guarding a seashell like it's a crown jewel, but that's what faith does. It turns ordinary things into sacred anchors. You walk inland again, feet sinking into wet sand until it fades into soil. The coastline recedes behind you, but the sound of the waves lingers in your ears, rhythmic and steady like a second heartbeat. You keep reaching down to touch your pouch, just to reassure yourself the shell is still there. You've heard stories of pilgrims being robbed of their shells by thieves who resell them to the next wave of hopeful travelers. Apparently, even in holiness, there's a resale market. By midday, you fall in with a group of pilgrims headed north. They too clutch their shells protectively. One woman from Gascony wears hers openly on a cord around her neck, polished to a mother-of-pearl shine. Another man has his stitched to his hat. He claims it makes bandits think twice before attacking. No one wants to rob the holy, he says. You suspect he's never met an actual bandit. As the road snakes through pine forests and small hamlets, you begin to notice how the shell changes the way people treat you. Locals greet you with warmth now, offering water and bread more freely. Children call out Santiaguino, and run alongside you for a few steps before darting away. The shell, once just a dream, has become your identity. It says you've been somewhere sacred. It says you belong to something larger than yourself. That evening, you share a meal around a fire with your new companions. Someone produces a lute, and soon there's laughter again. One of the men, an older merchant with a mischievous glint, tells of how some pilgrims cheat by buying shells near home. They say they've gone all the way, he chuckles, but their feet are soft as butter. You shake your head. The absurdity of walking hundreds of miles only to carry proof that you didn't walk hundreds of miles isn't lost on you. Then again, people do stranger things for reputation. Still, the shell means more to you now than a token. It's a conversation starter, a status symbol, even a form of currency in certain inns. Some monasteries grant free lodging to pilgrims who can show their authentic scallop shell, your medieval version of a verified badge. You can't help but laugh quietly. Somehow, holiness has always been a brand. The merchant pulls a smaller shell from his pocket, one carved from bone. Not the real thing, he says, but safer to carry. He explains that some pilgrims replace their fragile shells with replicas once they've made it home. Others hang the original in their churches or homes as protection against storms, sickness, and bad luck. You picture those shells dangling over hearths, catching candlelight, whispering sea wind into inland lives. You think of your own home, its walls, its small window, the corner where you'll hang your shell. It feels comforting, the idea that this little curved piece of ocean will remind you of everything you endured. Not the blisters, not the cold, but the perseverance. You imagine showing it to others, how they'll marvel, how they'll ask for your story. Maybe that's what the shell really is, a story starter, proof of wonder captured in calcium. As the night deepens, you hear another tale, a legend about a man who carried 2 shells, one for himself, one for a friend who couldn't make the journey. When he returned home, the second shell, they say, filled itself with seawater each night as a sign of the friend's salvation. It's a sweet myth, the kind that makes faith feel personal. You roll your shell in your palm, wondering if it, too, holds secrets. Somewhere between superstition and sincerity, humanity thrives. Pilgrims have long believed that the shell can heal illness or ward off misfortune. A medieval physician even wrote that powdered scallop mixed with honey cured melancholy, though you suspect that was just an early attempt at antidepressants with added crunch. Historians still argue whether such beliefs were genuine or just hopeful improvisations by desperate travelers, but either way, the shell gave people a sense of control in a world full of chaos. You fall asleep under a canopy of stars, the sea now only a whisper in memory. In your dreams, the ridges of your shell become roads again, spreading outward, endless and gleaming. Each one leads somewhere different, home, heaven, or maybe back to the shore. At dawn, mist clings to the fields. You rise stiffly, rubbing your feet and thinking that holiness has terrible ergonomics. But as you start walking, your mood lifts. The shell feels lighter today, as if it's carrying you instead of the other way around. You hum a tune you heard back at the beach, one that sounded like a lullaby and a prayer tangled together. You pass a bridge where an old beggar sits with a bowl. You drop in a coin, but he notices your shell and smiles. "Safe travels, pilgrim," he says. Then, with a wink, "That one's real. I can tell." You laugh, wondering how he knows. Maybe it's the faint smell of salt, or maybe it's just that pilgrims recognize each other in ways words can't describe. Further along, you encounter a group of young boys splashing in a stream, tossing shells like skipping stones. You almost call out to stop them, then realize they're using ordinary river shells, not sacred scallops. Still, you smile at the image, children playing with what, in another context, would be relics. It reminds you that meaning is elastic. What's holy in one pair of hands is just pretty junk in another. By evening, your little group finds lodging in a roadside inn. The keeper notices your shells immediately and offers discounted beds. "Pilgrims of the Apostle," he says with a grin, "always welcome." You trade your day's weariness for a bowl of stew and a straw mattress. Before sleep takes you, you set the shell on the table beside you, where it gleams faintly in candlelight. It feels like company, quiet, unassuming, eternal. You drift off imagining all the other shells resting on tables across Europe tonight. Thousands of pilgrims like you, each holding a small piece of ocean, each finding peace in the same simple shape. Maybe that's the real miracle of it all, that the sea, infinite and ungraspable, can fit into the palm of your hand and whisper, "You made it." You turn your face east again, toward home. The sea's roar fades behind you, replaced by wind through grass and the occasional bray of a stubborn donkey. The path feels lighter, yet lonelier. The pilgrimage isn't truly over, it just changes direction. Now, Instead of chasing salvation, you're carrying it. The shell swings from your belt, tapping softly against your thigh with each step, a rhythm that keeps time with your heartbeat. The road back is not as crowded as the one that led you here. Fewer songs, fewer bright faces. The ones you pass now are weary souls trudging onward, or else locals returning from market days. Yet when they spot the shell at your side, their expressions soften. You've become a symbol now, a walking story. They call you pilgrim, and some even beau. You try not to blush under the attention. Who knew seashells could confer instant holiness? In a way, it's comforting. You've crossed the edge of the world and survived. You've seen the ocean where legends end. Now, each footstep homeward feels like writing the final line of a long, impossible sentence. And yet, a question hums beneath the rhythm of your walk. What happens when the holy journey is over? How do you keep faith alive once the road disappears beneath your door? By afternoon, you reach a crossroads where travelers rest beneath an ancient oak. A few fellow pilgrims sit nearby, their shells gleaming faintly in the dappled light. You greet them with the ease of shared exhaustion. They trade stories like currency: who lost a boot in a swamp, who got chased by dogs, who swears they saw St. James himself riding across the sky. You listen, smiling. Everyone's tale has the same moral: we made it. One man from Lombardy unwraps his shell carefully, showing it off like a relic. "My wife will hang it above the hearth," he says proudly. "It will keep our home safe." Another woman admits she'll bury hairs in her garden, so her crops will grow with the blessing of the apostle. You glance at your own shell. You haven't decided its fate yet, but it already feels like an heirloom in the making. The conversation drifts into murmurs as a friar joins your circle. His robe is patched, his beard thick with dust. He carries no shell at all, only a simple wooden cross. When someone asks why, he smiles. "I prefer to travel light. Faith isn't something you carry, it carries you." You nod politely, though part of you disagrees. After all, isn't the whole point of the shell to hold that faith, to make it tangible? Historians still argue whether these objects were ever meant as proof or simply as memory. You suspect it's both. Humans have always needed reminders of what they've survived. As dusk settles, you all share bread, wine, and quiet laughter. One of the younger pilgrims, a red-haired lad with blistered feet, suddenly yelps. A stone has worn a hole clear through his sandal. You help patch it with a strip of cloth. Every pilgrim leaves a little piece of themselves behind. You joke. You're just ahead of schedule. The group laughs softly. Humor, it seems, travels lighter than doctrine. The next morning, fog rolls in thick as milk. You follow the sound of cowbells to find your path. The shell clinks reassuringly with each step, a little metronome of purpose. You begin to realize how much comfort it brings. You've had little else constant on this road. People come and go, weather shifts, faith wavers. But the shell, smooth, curved, silent, has never left your side. At midday, a farmer calls you over from his field. "Pilgrim," he says, pointing to your shell. "Bless my well." You blink in confusion, but he's insistent. They say water touched by the shell of Santiago brings luck. You humor him, dipping the shell into the well and murmuring something vaguely Latin-sounding. He beams and presses a hunk of cheese into your hand. You grin. Congratulations, you've just invented freelance holiness. As the day wanes, you find a small chapel beside the road. Inside, pilgrims have hung their shells on the wall, hundreds of them, overlapping like fish scales. You run your fingers along the edges, feeling the ridges smooth from years of touch. Each one tells the same story. Someone walked, someone believed, someone made it home. It's strange, seeing them all together. The individuality fades. What remains is the collective act of faith, stubborn and shining. You consider leaving yours here but hesitate. It feels too soon. Maybe one day. For now, you slip it back into your pouch, comforted by the weight. Further down the road, night overtakes you. The moon rises pale, the landscape silvered and ghostly. You walk until your legs beg for mercy, finally finding shelter in an abandoned barn. Lying there, the shell pressed against your chest, you think about all the miles behind and ahead. The road feels endless again, but in a gentler way. You wonder about the people who never made it back, the ones whose shells were buried with them in foreign soil. There's a quiet nobility in that. Pilgrimage was never guaranteed survival, it was an act of radical hope. Maybe that's why these shells mattered so much. They weren't just souvenirs, they were promises, proof that someone dared to believe in arrival even when arrival meant death. You smile in the dark. Your own shell might end up lost someday, traded or forgotten. But for now, it's yours, and it hums softly with the rhythm of the road. In the morning, the first light paints your shell with gold. You lift it to your ear, expecting to hear the sea again. Instead, you hear something else, the faint murmur of wind and birds, the whisper of your own breath. It sounds suspiciously like the world saying, "Keep going." And so you do. One step, one ridge, one ripple at a time. By now, the rhythm of walking feels like breathing, automatic, steady, and oddly meditative. You no longer think about where your feet land, the road simply happens beneath you. What surprises you most is how the world keeps reshaping itself. Fields turn to forests, forests dissolve into wind-scoured plains, and every few days there's another village that smells faintly of smoke, beer, and freshly turned soil. You start to notice how the shell at your belt changes color under the light. Some days it's pearly white, other days bronze with dust. The ridges catch sunlight in thin slivers, like veins of metal. It's as if the road itself is painting it, a slow collaboration between nature and faith. You joke to yourself that you'll return home with a medieval mood ring. Villagers still recognize you instantly. "Ah, a pilgrim," they say, offering a nod or a blessing, or occasionally, a sly sales pitch. You meet a blacksmith who sells tiny metal cases shaped like shells to protect the real ones from breaking. He swears his design is saint-approved. Another merchant claims his dyed blue shells are more heavenly than the common white kind. It seems you can sanctify almost anything with good marketing. Still, you can't deny that the shell carries real weight in people's minds. One evening, in a tavern buzzing with voices, you see a local man lean close to examine your scallop. "You've truly been to the sea?" he asks, wide-eyed. When you nod, he presses a hand to his chest and whispers, "Then you've seen the edge of creation." You smile awkwardly, not sure whether to correct him or just let the poetry stand. Because in a way, he's right, the ocean did feel like an edge. And it changed you, even if you can't explain how. Later that night, sitting near the fire, you pull the shell from your pouch and trace its ridges. You think about what they mean, the ancient symbol of pilgrimage, the path radiating from one center outward, just like the roots converging on Santiago. Some say that pattern was intentional, a metaphor designed by early Christians. Others argue it was a happy coincidence, that the scallop's geometry simply lent itself to spiritual interpretation. Historians still argue whether the design was divine inspiration or just clever branding. You lean toward the latter. After all, medieval faith and marketing were practically siblings. As the fire crackles, a traveler across the room raises his mug. "To the shells," he calls. Everyone cheers. You can't tell if they are serious or just slightly drunk, but either way, the sound fills the room with warmth. The shell, you realize, connects strangers. It's an unspoken passport. The next morning, you cross a shallow river at dawn. The water is glass clear, and as you wade through, you notice the sand glittering with tiny fragments, bits of freshwater shells. Instinctively, you stoop to pick one up. It's fragile and translucent, no bigger than your thumbnail. You turn it in your fingers, wondering if it, too, will someday carry meaning for someone. Then, with a smile, you drop it back into the current. The river will carry it further than you ever could. By midday, you pass a small roadside shrine, a weathered statue of St. James, his stone cloak covered in carved shells. Pilgrims have pressed offerings at his feet, bits of ribbon, coins, dried flowers, and, of course, real scallops. You add yours briefly to the pile, whispering a small thank you before slipping it back. Some might call that selfish, but you're not ready to part with it. Faith, like souvenirs, works best when it's personal. Further on, the land rises. You climb into rolling hills where wind howls through heather and grass like a choir gone feral. Up here, you're mostly alone. You hum to yourself to keep company. It's funny, before the journey, silence made you uneasy. Now it feels sacred. You think of the monks you passed weeks ago, their vows of silence, their calm, patient eyes. Maybe the shell's ridges aren't roads after all. Maybe they are echoes, lines of quiet leading back to yourself. You stop to rest beneath a crumbling watchtower, eating bread and cheese from your pack. A hawk circles overhead, its cry slicing through the wind. You pull out the shell again, mostly out of habit. It feels smooth now, almost soft from the oil of your hands. You imagine all the other shells being carried this very moment by pilgrims scattered across Europe. Each one different, yet all whispering the same refrain, you kept going. A thought crosses your mind, what happens to the shells that break along the road? You've seen shattered ones before, lying abandoned near streams or crossroads. Their owners must have grieved. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe that's part of the lesson, even holiness can crack, and that's okay. It's still beautiful, just in smaller pieces. As dusk creeps in, you reach a small village where the innkeeper recognizes your shell immediately. He tells you of a local custom. Villagers hang shells above their doorways to ward off evil spirits and jealous neighbors. It's the ridges, he says knowingly. They confuse the devil. He can't count them all. You nearly choke on your ale laughing. That's one way to keep demons busy. Give them math homework. Later, lying in the straw, you wonder how many layers of meaning one shell can carry. For some, it's a holy badge. For others, a talisman, a map, a shield. You suspect the truth is simpler. It's a story condensed into shape. Every pilgrim who's ever touched one has added a grain of meaning, like sand layering over centuries. That's how myths are built, not from miracles, but from repetition. You dream that night of the sea again, waves curling into ridges that look exactly like the shell in your hand. In the dream, the water whispers something you can't quite catch. When you wake, you half expect to find sand in your bedroll. Morning dawns pale and cold. You sling your pack, stretch aching muscles, and start walking again. The shell taps gently against your belt, keeping time with the rhythm of your steps. Somewhere ahead lies home, but for now, the journey itself is enough. You smile into the wind, thinking that perhaps every pilgrim's real relic isn't the shell at all, it's the version of themselves who carried it. Days stretch like ribbons now, long and pale under a sun that can't decide whether it's benevolent or cruel. Your feet ache, but they've grown obedient, quiet workers carrying you through fatigue and weather. The shell swings from your cord, lighter with each passing mile, as if it's slowly absorbing some of your weariness. You begin to suspect that's its secret purpose, not to bless you, but to share the load. You cross into flatter country, where wheat fields roll endlessly and the sky feels almost arrogant in its size. In the distance, a monastery bell rings, echoing faintly like the memory of an ocean wave. You smile. Even inland, the world can't quite forget the sea. At a crossroads, you pause by a stone marker etched with a familiar symbol. The scallop shell carved in relief, its ridges leading toward a small arrow. You trace the grooves with your thumb. The design is everywhere now, on markers, door lintels, even bakeries that sell holy bread shaped like shells. You can't help but laugh softly. Faith, you think, comes with great branding. A cart rumbles past, its driver waving cheerfully. Santiago, he calls, and when you nod, he gestures proudly at the scallop carved into the front of his wagon. Keeps the wheels turning, he shouts. You wave back, grinning. You've seen the shell serve as everything from road sign to lucky charm to drinking cup. It's become universal shorthand for hope. By noon, you reach a town bustling with market day chaos, shouts, clattering pots, and the bray of animals who definitely didn't sign up for this pilgrimage. As you weave through the crowd, you notice stalls selling shells strung into necklaces, sewn onto hats, even painted onto ceramic jugs. A young vendor, barely old enough to shave, calls to you. Real shells from the Holy Coast. Freshly blessed. He winks as he says it, knowing you know better. Still, you admire his confidence. In another life, he'd be running a startup. You stop for lunch, a hunk of bread and a cup of wine, and watch the crowd. Pilgrims and locals mingle easily here. The distinction blurs. You spot a noblewoman wearing a polished shell pinned to her gown purely as decoration, its spiritual meaning long forgotten. Across the square, a beggar holds up another, cracked and yellowed, claiming it heals toothache. Historians still argue whether the scallop's power came from faith or folklore, but you suspect they were always the same thing. People believe what helps them sleep at night. As the day wanes, you find yourself drawn to the church at the edge of town. Its wooden doors are carved with familiar ridged patterns, scallops stacked like ripples in water. Inside, it's cool and dim. Candles flicker, their light bouncing across the polished shell motifs lining the altar. You kneel, not out of obligation but habit, and run your fingers along one of the carvings. It's worn smooth by centuries of touch. You wonder how many hands before yours pressed here, each believing in something unseen. A priest appears, moving quietly like smoke. He smiles when he sees your shell. The mark of the apostle, he says. You nod. He tells you that long ago, before the Pilgrims, the shell symbolized rebirth, linked not to saints but to Venus, goddess of love, who was said to rise from the sea upon one. The church, he adds with a small shrug, recycled it. You can't help laughing softly. Even holiness has second lives. He nods, amused. Indeed. What matters isn't who first used it, but what it means to you now. You think about that as you leave, sunlight spilling over the threshold. Symbols survive because we keep giving them meaning, like a campfire that never goes out because someone's always tending the flame. The road east turns dusty again, lined with olive trees and cicadas that buzz like living static. You walk alone most of the day, mind wandering. You start to imagine the shell as a kind of mirror, not reflecting your face, but your endurance. Every ridge a memory, the rainstorms, the laughter, the blisters, the sea. You've become your own reliquary, carrying pieces of the road inside you. That night, you camp by a small stream. You take off your boots and soak your feet, watching minnows dart through the shallows. Then, almost without thinking, you dip your shell into the water. The ripples fan outward, mirroring its shape. You take a sip. The cold stings your tongue, earthy and clean. For a brief moment, it tastes exactly like the sea. A rustling nearby startles you. It's just a stray dog, lean and curious, watching you with tilted head. You toss it a crumb of bread, and it settles beside you with a sigh. The two of you sit in companionable silence, the kind that feels earned. You whisper to the shell, "You've seen more of the world than I have." The dog gives a low huff, as if agreeing. You smile. It's ridiculous, talking to an inanimate object. But on this road, ridiculousness is a kind of prayer. Before sleeping, you tie the shell tighter to your belt. You dream again of the sea, but this time it's calm, glassy, reflecting stars instead of swallowing them. You stand at the edge, holding your shell to the sky, and the stars fill its ridges like water. Morning comes too soon. You wake with dew in your hair and determination in your chest. The dog is gone, but a single paw print remains beside your sleeping spot, a reminder that all travelers, human or not, leave some trace behind. As you shoulder your pack, you touch the shell once more and realize something quietly profound. It doesn't just mark where you've been, it points, always, toward what's still possible. And so you keep walking. The road home begins to look familiar now, an echo of landscapes you've already crossed, only softer around the edges. You recognize a crooked oak, a chapel wall stained with moss, the smell of wet soil after rain. Everything feels slightly smaller, as if the world has exhaled since you left it. You, however, have stretched, inside, at least. The shell at your hip reminds you of that with every gentle tap, proof of distance turned into devotion. You stop at a stream to refill your flask and notice a young boy watching from the opposite bank. His eyes widen at the sight of your shell. "Are you a pilgrim?" he calls out. You nod, grinning. He darts closer, splashing through the shallows to peer at it. "Can I touch it?" he asks. You let him, and his small fingers trace the ridges reverently. "It feels like waves," he whispers. You smile at the poetry in his voice, better than anything a scholar could write. He asks what it means, and you try to explain without sounding too grand. "It means I walked far and made it back," you say simply. He nods, serious as a monk, then runs off yelling to his friends, "The pilgrim came back." You watch him disappear into the trees and can't help chuckling. For him, you might as well be a knight returned from dragons. As you continue walking, the shell becomes a magnet for questions. Farmers at wells, women at market stalls, shepherds in fields, they all want to hear the same thing. What was it like? You do your best to describe the sea, the sound of gulls, the endlessness of it all. Sometimes you embellish a little, add a miraculous glow here, a talking fish there. What's the harm? Stories are souvenirs too. By midday, you reach a bustling town where a fair is underway. Bright banners ripple in the wind, and the smell of roasted meat makes your stomach growl. Among the stalls, you spot something unexpected, a vendor selling scallop shells, hundreds of them, strung up like wind chimes. Some are painted gold, others carved with tiny crosses. You pick one up and ask, "Are these from the sea?" The vendor winks. "From a sea, certainly." You laugh. He lowers his voice conspiratorially. "Truth is, I buy them from fishermen up north. But people don't come for salt, they come for meaning." You nod, understanding more than he knows. The medieval souvenir trade is booming, and part of you admires the audacity. Humans have an unbreakable instinct to bottle ore and sell it wholesale. You continue exploring, finding that almost every booth sells something with a shell on it. Candles, charms, even pastries shaped like scallops. The line between faith and festivity has blurred completely. You overhear a friar scolding a group of young men for gambling with shells as tokens. "They are sacred, not dice," he cries. One of the men shrugs. "Maybe St. James likes to play." You snort into your cup of cider. Somewhere, the apostle is either laughing or face-palming. In a quieter corner, a woman carves shells into pendants. You watch as she etches fine lines into one with a small knife. "For luck?" you ask. "For memory," she replies. Every line, a road someone walked. You show her yours, the one you carried from the sea. She studies it closely, then nods. This one's lived, she says. Keep it close. You promise you will. That night, you stay in the loft of a tavern overlooking the square. Music drifts up through the floorboards, lutes and laughter, the sweet scent of ale and pine smoke. You set your shell on the windowsill and watch the moonlight play across it. For a moment, you remember the beach, the cold bite of the ocean, the feeling of completion. But it's different now. The holiness has softened into something more personal, like a secret you carry not for sainthood but for yourself. You fall asleep thinking about how every pilgrim's shell eventually ends up somewhere, hung above a doorway, buried in a field, forgotten in a drawer. Some even get passed down generations until the story blurs. Maybe that's the real afterlife of relics. They outlive their owners but still carry their fingerprints. When morning comes, you set off again. A light rain begins, and the world smells like stone and grass. The shell darkens, wet and gleaming, each ridge catching a droplet. It looks almost alive, like something breathing with you. You remember hearing once that in some regions, people believed the scallop shape echoed the human heart, that each line represented a path of love leading back to one center. Historians still argue whether that's symbolic nonsense or ancient anatomy, but it doesn't matter. It feels right. As the day wears on, the road climbs into hills, and mist curls around your ankles like slow smoke. You walk through it, half dreaming, until you come upon a hermit's hut tucked under a cliff. He steps out, gray-bearded and barefoot, with eyes that look like he's seen too much serenity. He notices your shell and smiles. Still walking, he asks. Always, you reply. He nods as though you've passed a test. He tells you that pilgrims sometimes leave their shells here, hanging them on the wooden cross by his door. They say it helps them let go, he murmurs. You glance at the small cluster of shells swaying in the mist. For a moment, you consider adding yours. But no, you're not ready to let go yet. You thank him and move on. That night, you make camp on a ridge where the stars spread thick across the sky. You take out the shell, hold it up against the constellations, and imagine each ridge tracing a line of light across the heavens. Somewhere, 1,000 other pilgrims might be doing the same thing, each holding a tiny reflection of the same sky. You close your eyes, feeling the wind cool on your face, the shell warm in your palm. You whisper, almost without meaning to, "Keep me steady." The shell doesn't answer, of course, but the silence feels like agreement. The world grows greener as you descend from the hills. Meadows spread wide, dappled with cows and the smell of clover. Streams chuckle their way through stones, and the sun filters softly through a haze that feels almost kind. After weeks of austerity, mud, blisters, silence, this lushness feels like reward. Your steps fall easier, your shell tapping a slow rhythm at your side like a contented heartbeat. You pass a shepherd leaning on his staff, humming to his flock. He spots your shell and raises a hand in greeting. "Back from Santiago," he calls. You nod, and he smiles as though you've just returned from the moon. "Then you've seen what most only dream of," he says. You thank him, feeling that mix of pride and humility that comes with being congratulated for surviving. The road dips through farmland, where scarecrows stand like tired saints. Every so often, you spot a scallop shell nailed above a doorway or tied to a barn beam. You ask a farmer about it over a shared lunch of bread and onion soup. He shrugs. "Keeps the storms away, or so my grandmother said." You glance up at the shell hanging by the rafters, its edges blackened by smoke. "Does it work?" you ask. He grins. "I'm still here, aren't I?" That answer stays with you. Maybe faith isn't about preventing storms, but about surviving them, and then hanging the proof above your door. A few miles later, you reach a crossroads chapel built entirely from local stone. It's small but immaculate, the air inside thick with candle wax and age. Dozens of shells line the walls, strung on cords or placed delicately at the base of the altar. Some are polished smooth, others broken and mended with metal staples. You kneel and touch one that's been patched together. It feels oddly hopeful. Faith repaired is faith tested. A woman in a faded veil kneels beside you, whispering prayers. When she notices your shell, she nods knowingly. "I went too," she says softly. "Many years ago." She holds up her own, a small, yellowed scallop, its ridges nearly worn flat. "My husband took the same road," she adds. "But his shell came back without him." You feel the air tighten, the unsaid words hanging between you. You murmur, "Then it carried both of you." She smiles faintly. "Yes, it still does." Outside, you sit on the steps and breathe. Pilgrimage is full of ghosts, of those who walked before, of those who never returned. The shells remember all of them, silent witnesses to millions of small, stubborn acts of devotion. Historians still argue whether the scallop's popularity came from theology or practicality, but you're beginning to suspect it was something deeper, a shared language of survival. That night, you find lodging in a monastery. The monks, serene as granite, welcome you with bowls of lentils and endless water. Their dormitory walls are covered in carved scallops, each slightly different, as if the stone itself were alive. One monk explains that every brother carves one shell upon taking his vows, a symbol that they, too, are travelers, just in place. You like that? The idea that stillness can be its own kind of pilgrimage. Before sleep, you sit in the courtyard beneath a sky frosted with stars. The air smells faintly of thyme and candle smoke. You turn your shell over and over in your hands, tracing its ridges as you whisper a quiet prayer of gratitude. Not the kind that asks for anything, just thanks for the road, for your body, for the strange gift of arriving. In the morning, the bell wakes you before dawn. The monks invite you to join their prayer, and you do, standing among their voices like one more note in a long, patient hymn. When it ends, one of them presses a small wooden bead into your hand. "To remember this stop on your road," he says. You tie it to your cord, just above your shell. Together, they clack softly as you walk out into the light, two small echoes of belief. The road east leads through mist again. You pass a ruined bridge, its stones slick with moss, and beyond it a field of wildflowers so bright it looks like someone spilled a painter's palette. You pause there, overwhelmed for no good reason, and realize how close you are to home. The thought is both comforting and strange. You wonder what your neighbors will say when they see your shell. Will they understand what it means? Will they laugh, call it superstition? Maybe. But you know the truth, it isn't just a token. It's a map of endurance. A record of every moment you didn't quit. By evening, you reach another small inn. The owner, a wiry man with kind eyes, notices your shell immediately. "We used to see many like you," he says wistfully. "Fewer these days. The young prefer shorter miracles." You smile at that, an accurate summary of the human condition. He asks if he can hold your shell. You hand it over, and he studies it under the firelight. "It's been kissed by salt," he murmurs. "You went all the way." He gives it back with reverence, as though it might crumble under rough hands. That night, the wind outside howls, rattling shutters and whistling through cracks. You lie awake, listening to it tug at the walls. Your shell rests on the table beside you, steady and still, a reminder of every tempest you've already endured. You reach for it, feel its smoothness against your palm, and think, "I am the calm that survived the storm." Somewhere, faintly, you think you can still hear the sea. By now the shell feels like part of you, less an ornament, more an organ that beats quietly beside your heart. You've been home for weeks, but its presence keeps you moving in your mind, tracing phantom miles along dusty roads. When you look at it, you can still taste the sea's salt at the back of your throat, hear the gulls cackling over waves. Your neighbors have started calling you the Pilgrim, as though the title might stick permanently. You smile when they do, because the truth is, you're not sure you ever stopped walking. One evening, after chores are done and the cows have given up their last reluctant milk, you find yourself at the tavern. The air is thick with ale and laughter. The fire pops, spitting tiny stars. People urge you to tell the story again, how far you walked, what you saw, whether St. James himself whispered in your ear. You exaggerate just enough to hold their attention. You describe the long roads shining under moonlight, the golden glow at Compostela, the shimmer of shells along the shore. Someone gasps. Someone else rolls their eyes. You wink. Maybe half of it's true, you say, but the blisters were real enough. As the night deepens, others begin to share their own tales. A woman swears her grandfather's shell once healed a fever. A man insists his uncle's shell glowed faintly during a storm. You raise an eyebrow. Maybe it was lightning. He grins. Maybe it was grace. The crowd murmurs approval. You notice how easily the line blurs between faith and fable once ale gets involved. But the stories matter, truth optional. Later, outside, the cool air sobers the room's warmth from your skin. You can hear a fiddle through the open shutters, and beyond that, crickets. You touch your shell, hanging now from your belt, and think of all the other stories it might hold, the unspoken kind. Pilgrims who never made it back. Those who turned their shells into charms, love tokens, or even currency. You remember meeting a tinker on the road who told you he melted shells into lime for whitewash, to bless the walls. Another pilgrim once swore his shell let him hear the sea no matter how far inland he went. You tried it yourself once, pressing the ridges to your ear, and for a moment, you could have sworn you heard it too. Historians still argue whether that was faith or acoustics. You decide it doesn't matter, it's the same sound either way. Over the next days, you notice how every story about shells seems to ripple outward. Children carve them into their playthings, lovers exchange them instead of rings. One morning, you find a small shell placed on your doorstep. No note. Just the shell. A quiet gift. You hang it beside your own. Two now, side by side, the start of a small shrine. Word spreads that you tell good stories. Travelers passing through your village stop by to hear them. Some bring their own shells, each with its own tale. One found in a dead man's pocket, another traded for a loaf of bread, one that survived a shipwreck. You listen, fascinated. It dawns on you that these shells are more than proof of travel. They're the medieval version of a social network, connecting strangers through shared awe. Sometimes, around the hearth, the stories take darker turns. Someone recalls a pilgrim who drowned trying to collect a shell during a storm. Another claims he saw thieves ambush travelers for their scallops, thinking them gold. You shiver. All for a bit of calcium carbonate, you mutter, earning a laugh. Faith is expensive, someone quips back. But there are tender stories too. A widow tells you she keeps her husband's shell under his pillow, so his spirit can keep traveling. A young girl says she wants to walk to the ocean one day just to find one for herself. You tell her she doesn't have to walk that far, she can borrow yours. She beams, and you realize this is how legends begin. One shell at a time, passed from hand to hand until it no longer belongs to anyone, and thus belongs to everyone. You start carving simple scenes onto your shell in the evenings. A road, a wave, a small cross. Each night you add another mark, careful not to crack it. It becomes a diary you don't have to read aloud. One morning, the village priest visits and notices it glinting by your window. He picks it up gently, turning it in the light. The scallop, he muses, was said to resemble the human journey, many paths, one center. You smile. I think it just looks like a good idea someone had at the beach. He laughs softly. Both can be true. When winter comes, the fields freeze, and the road disappears beneath frost. You find yourself missing the pilgrimage, the rhythm of it, the quiet conversations with strangers who knew exactly how your feet felt. You start walking short loops around the village just to feel the air move. The shell taps lightly as you go, and villagers nod, smiling knowingly. One morning, snow muffles everything, the trees, the river, even the church bell. The world feels like a painting. You pause by the frozen stream and take out your shell. Its pale curves mirror the snowdrifts, its ridges filled with white. You think of all the hands that once reached into the same ocean, each taking a small piece of the same vast thing. The idea soothes you. You tuck it back close to your chest, whispering, still traveling. That night, you dream of the sea again, not wild and endless as before, but calm, folding gently over your feet. You can hear voices in the waves, each one a story you once heard or told. The tide retreats, leaving shells behind in neat rows, as if returning every borrowed tale. You pick one up, hold it to your ear, and this time, the voice that answers is your own. You wake before dawn, smiling in the dark. The fire has gone out, but your shell glows faintly in the gray light. Maybe reflection, maybe grace, again, it doesn't matter. You run your thumb along its edge, and for a moment, it feels like it's breathing. You whisper, thank you, not sure if you mean the shell, the journey, or the fact that stories, like pilgrims, never really stop walking. Years pass, and the world begins to tilt in strange new directions. The air thickens with rumor and reform, and the old pilgrim roads grow quiet. You notice fewer travelers trudging past your door, fewer shells glinting on belts or hanging from cloaks. Where once the tavern rang with stories of Compostela, now it hums with talk of kings, taxes, and the latest whispers about priests who quarrel over how many relics count as real. The seashell, once the passport of the pious, is starting to look more like an antique. You keep yours still, hanging in the window where the morning sun touches it. Its once bright ridges have dulled, and a fine crack runs down its side. It looks like the world, still beautiful, but slightly fractured. Sometimes you lift it to your ear and wonder whether the sea inside it has fallen silent, or whether you've simply stopped listening closely enough. On market days, you overhear traders lament that the pilgrim business isn't what it used to be. Inns along the old routes are shuttered. Relic vendors have moved on to hawking more fashionable miracles, tiny fragments of saints' toenails, or, for the very daring, bits of holy soot. You smirk at the absurdity. Faith, it seems, always finds a new way to merchandise itself. One afternoon, a dusty traveler stops by your house, asking for water. He notices your shell and laughs softly. I used to carry one of those, he says. You pour him a cup and ask, used to? He shrugs. Left it behind in Lyon. Nobody believes in walking anymore. They say you can buy forgiveness cheaper from the pulpit. You smile sadly. Forgiveness is easy. It's the walking that's hard. He nods, drinks, and moves on, leaving behind the faint smell of road dust and nostalgia. You watch him disappear down the path and realize how rare he is now, a real pilgrim. A member of a vanishing tribe. The churches try to keep the tradition alive, organizing processions and miniature pilgrimages within city walls. But it's not the same. You hear stories of mock seashells being cast in pewter, sold as tokens for people who never left home. It's symbolic, the clergy insist. The heart travels where the feet cannot. You want to believe that, but something in you rebels. The heart, you think, only learns to move after the souls are blistered. Historians centuries later will still argue whether the decline of pilgrimages was caused by the Black Death, the Reformation, or simple exhaustion. Probably all of them. You live through whispers of each: the sickness that sweeps through nearby villages, the preachers who rail against indulgences, the creeping sense that faith is being rewritten in smaller, tidier fonts. You can almost feel the tide going out, dragging your old world with it. One evening, you visit the local chapel, the same one that once shimmered with the light of hanging shells. Most are gone now. Only a few remain, their cords frayed, their colors bleached to bone white. The air smells of dust and incense that's lost its courage. You kneel, touching one of the shells, and feel something like grief, not for yourself, but for the idea that once made you walk so far. Outside, the town has changed. New inns stand where the old pilgrim hostels were, but their guests are merchants, not penitents. The conversations have shifted from salvation to profit margins. Even the tavern songs have lost their roads and seas. You sip your ale and listen as younger men laugh about the foolish days when people walked hundreds of miles just for a blessing. You raise your mug, muttering, "At least we had the calves for it," which earns a round of laughter. Still, the longing doesn't fade. Some nights, when the moon is full, you imagine the old paths glowing faintly in the dark, like veins of memory still pulsing beneath the earth. Maybe they never truly vanish. Maybe every footstep leaves a trace that time can't quite erase. One day, while tending your garden, you find a small child watching you through the fence. He points at your window. "What's that?" he asks. You glance over your shoulder at the shell. "That," you say, "is a piece of the sea I once carried home." His eyes widen. "You went to the sea?" You nod. "And back again?" He grins, missing a tooth. "Can you tell me the story?" So you do. You tell him about the road, the waves, the miracle that wasn't a miracle but felt like one anyway. He listens, utterly still, as if you're unspooling magic right into the air. When you finish, he says, "I want to go too someday." You smile. You will. And something in you eases, because as long as someone wants to walk, the story isn't over. Years later, after you're gone, that same child grows up and finds your shell still hanging by the window. He takes it down, ties it to his belt, and sets off toward the west. The road greets him like an old friend. Others join him along the way. Slowly, the path stirs again, the dust rising where once your feet pressed the earth. And so the shell endures, not just as a relic, but as a relay baton passed across generations. Its grooves hold the fingerprints of everyone who's ever touched it. Each pilgrim adds another thin layer of meaning, like sand layering over time. The seashell becomes what it always was meant to be, a fossil of faith, shaped by the tides of human need. As the world shifts from parchment to print, people start writing about pilgrims instead of becoming them. Ballads, travelogues, and moral tales circulate, half history, half nostalgia. You become a character in someone else's bedtime story, your footsteps reduced to sentences. But that's how legends survive. They trade breath for ink and keep walking. The seashell, meanwhile, waits quietly. Buried in drawers, nailed to rafters, tucked into the corners of museums. It doesn't mind the silence. It's patient. It has seen empires fall and fashions fade. It knows the tide always returns. Centuries slide by like sand through the fingers of the sea, and the old pilgrim roads begin to breathe again. You would hardly recognize them now. Paved here, trimmed there, stitched together by modern maps and bright yellow arrows that mimic the sunburst lines of your old scallop. New pilgrims, some carrying smartphones, others prayer beads, step into the same dust you once knew, though they'd call it trail grit and log it on an app. Yet, for all their gadgets and ergonomic boots, The feeling is uncannily familiar. You can almost hear your own footsteps loud beneath theirs. They come for many reasons, some ancient, some updated. A man from Seoul walks to grieve his brother. A woman from Berlin hopes to detox from her job. A college student from New York calls it spiritual cardio. Still, every one of them carries a shell, tied to a backpack or pinned to a hat. The scallop has become both relic and logo, faith and fashion. You watch from the long corridor of memory, amused. You remember how, centuries ago, nobles embroidered shells in silver thread to look holy without sweating for it. The modern pilgrims aren't so different. They post their blisters online for likes, their devotion framed in sunrise selfies. And yet, something real still hums beneath it all. Each step, each ache, each whispered prayer in the wind still feels like an echo of your own road. The same mountains lean over them. The same gulls trace white arcs over the same sea. Historians still argue whether the modern Camino revival is religious or secular, but you know better, it's both. Faith and tourism have always shared a tent, arguing over who gets the top bunk. A group of walkers reaches the coast. Their guide, wearing a neon vest and the patience of a saint, explains that collecting a shell was once a sacred ritual, proof of penance completed. Today, he adds, you can also buy one for €3 at the gift shop. The group laughs, but a few wander toward the tide anyway. One woman kneels in the foam, picking up a small, pearly shell. She holds it like something fragile and immense. When she stands, her eyes are wet, not from the salt spray. You smile. Some moments don't need interpretation. Later that night, the pilgrims gather in a seaside hostel. They eat lentils, drink wine, and swap stories in 6 languages at once. One tells of a storm that nearly washed him off a ridge. Another admits she almost quit but saw a rainbow and decided the universe was flirting with her. Someone jokes that if medieval pilgrims had had energy drinks, half the saints wouldn't have been canonized. The room erupts in laughter. The shell, once a grave badge of piety, has become a social spark again. You drift among them, unseen but deeply recognized in their tired smiles and raw feet. You hear one of them murmur, "It feels like the world still remembers where it wants us to walk." You wish you could answer, "It does." The road has a long memory. In the morning, they set off again, shells clinking softly like wind chimes. Some hang from string, others are carved into jewelry or inked as tattoos. The scallop shape appears on trail markers, city signs, even coffee mugs. What once marked the pilgrim now guides the traveler. The emblem has evolved from proof of completion to invitation, an arrow back to meaning. A museum exhibit opens in Santiago, displaying ancient shells found in graves and monasteries. Visitors press close to the glass, staring at the same ridges you once touched. The curator explains how the scallop represented more than St. James. It stood for resurrection, rebirth, and the meeting of many paths. You watch a child trace the shell's outline against the glass, then glance up at her parents. "Can we go there someday?" she asks. Her mother nods. "Maybe when you're older." You smile again. The cycle never stops. Outside, new pilgrims pour into the plaza before the cathedral. Some fall to their knees, others lift their phones high. You can almost hear your own voice whispering across time, "Don't forget to actually look." The square buzzes with joy and exhaustion, that peculiar mix of pain and awe that transcends centuries. The shells they carry glitter under the sun, plastic, wood, metal, real. It doesn't matter. What matters is the gesture, the lineage of belief in something beyond the horizon. Not far away, an old man sits on a bench, polishing a shell strung on a cord. He's not walking anymore, but when travelers ask about it, he tells stories, the same ones you told, or something close enough. It's a reminder, he says. That we're all trying to get somewhere, even when we don't know where that is. He grins. And the shell doesn't care if you find it. You love that. The humility of it. The recognition that the shell was never about arrival. It was about the walking, the failing, the getting up again. In a cafe near the trail, a woman writes postcards under a sign that reads Buon Camino. She draws a tiny scallop beside her name, unaware she's repeating a 1,000-year-old gesture. Each curl of her pen mirrors the shell's spiral, language itself tracing back to pilgrimage. The world may have satellites and sneakers now, but the seashell keeps whispering the same quiet challenge. Move. Search. Return. You imagine it calling across oceans, luring the restless, the grieving, the curious. People answer without knowing why, packing their lives into small backpacks and walking toward a western horizon that still glows with mystery. At dusk, the tide rolls in. The pilgrims sit along the rocks, their shells catching the last light. Some pray, some cry, some just watch. The sea accepts all of them equally, washing the day clean. You stand among them in memory, feeling the cool mist on your face, the weight of the old world dissolving into the new. The scallop remains, its grooves holding every step, every wish, every era. Somewhere inland, another child finds a shell in a souvenir shop, holds it up to his ear, and hears the ocean roaring inside. He doesn't know it yet, but he's listening to you. The sea never keeps still for long. It breathes, it swells, it forgets, and then it remembers. You return to it now, in memory or dream, standing where the sand folds over itself like soft parchment. The tide draws its long white lines, erasing footsteps that once told stories only the waves could read. Your shell, long carried, long cherished, trembles at your side. It feels almost eager, as if it's ready to go home. You bend down and let the surf curl around your ankles. The water is cold, the kind that wakes you all the way to your spine. For a moment, the world smells exactly as it did centuries ago. Salt, kelp, wet stone, and that faint metallic tang that means both ending and beginning. You crouch, the sea hissing and murmuring in its endless monologue, and you open your hand. The shell gleams, wet and alive again. It catches the light in its grooves, each ridge a road you once walked, each hollow a night you once endured. You think of the pilgrims who came before you and after you, the countless hands that lifted shells toward the same horizon. Some prayed, some cursed, some simply wondered. You smile. Faith, it turns out, has always been a kind of curiosity. You lower the shell into the water. The sea folds around it, tugging gently, then claiming it with a swirl of foam. It vanishes into the shimmer, as if swallowed by light. You feel lighter too. The moment is so quiet you can almost hear time exhale. A gull wheels overhead, laughing in that harsh, perfect way that gulls do, as if mocking the solemnity of humans who assign meaning to calcium and tide. You grin up at it. Fair enough, you whisper. But we try. You stay a long while, watching the surf deliver and retrieve, shells and stones and driftwood. It's an endless conversation. The sea offers, the land accepts, then lets go. And you realize that's what the pilgrims were doing all along, trading pieces of themselves with the world, giving something back with every step. Behind you, the modern world hums faintly, cars, distant music, a trail marker painted bright yellow. The ancient and the new overlap seamlessly, one continuous pilgrimage of bodies and stories. You feel strangely at peace with that. After all, the scallop was never about belonging to one century, it was about bridging them. You walk along the beach as twilight deepens, the waves glinting pewter. Occasionally, another shell washes up, whispering against the sand. You resist the urge to pick it up. You've done your part. Someone else will find it, hold it, carry it inland and give it meaning again. That's the rhythm. The sea sends, humans translate, time repeats. Historians still argue whether medieval pilgrims truly believed the shell held divine power, or whether it was just the perfect travel memento, light, lovely, symbolic. You think maybe both are true. Humans need tangible proof of wonder. Something small enough to pocket but vast enough to dream into. The scallop, with its 1,000 tiny ribs, is the perfect paradox, earthly geometry carved by an infinite hand. You pause to watch the last blush of sun sink beneath the horizon. The sky and the sea trade colors until you can't tell where one ends. A hush falls. You close your eyes and breathe in the damp air, hearing faint echoes of the roads, the inns, the laughter, the prayers whispered into wind centuries deep. You feel them all, the old monks, the barefoot peasants, the modern hikers, the child clutching a souvenir shell. Every story loops back to this moment, this shade, shimmering breath beside the ocean. For a moment, you think you hear the shell's voice again, not from your hand, but from everywhere at once. It says nothing grand, just a soft hum that sounds a lot like continue walking. You smile. You know you will. The sea quiets, its earlier chatter softening into a slow, sleepy pulse. The light fades, turning the horizon from silver to indigo, then finally to the color of closed eyes. The sand cools underfoot, and the last waves stretch themselves thin, sighing over your toes before retreating to rest. You breathe with them, steady, deep, matching their rhythm until you can't tell whether you are inhaling the tide or the tide is exhaling you. Somewhere behind you, the land sleeps. The roads you once walked dissolve into mist, their stories folded neatly into the earth. But their memory lingers like warmth after a candle goes out. The shells, the songs, the small acts of belief, they've all done their work. The world remembers, quietly, without needing to speak. You tilt your head back, feeling the last trace of wind move through your hair. The stars have returned, faint but deliberate, like old friends finding their places again. You realize how vast the sky has always been, how generous the sea remains, and how much smaller your own worries feel under both. The ocean hums low and slow, a lullaby in a language you once knew by heart. You take one final breath of salt air and let your shoulders sink. Everything loosens, the day, the story, even your thoughts. The world turns soft, edges blurring. The sea keeps whispering, its pulse gentle now, as if tucking you in. You don't need to walk anymore. You've already arrived. Sweet dreams.